Okay, so I'll just introduce Mr. Rohit Uchil. So he's a mechanical engineer and he has started his career in HVAC projects from 1995. So after spending 7 years in MEP design consultancy with SK Murthy Consulting Engineers from 97 to 2003, he has established integrated technical services as a disciplinary MEP consultant in January 2004. His firm has been engaged with MEP consultancy services uh, for building services, including residential, commercial, as well as industrial and institutional projects. Um, his firm has strong teams of technical professionals across various electrical and mechanical disciplines. Uh, they are specialized in commercial, corporate office project, corporate headquarters, hotel residential projects, urban hotels and resorts, apartments, different complexes and townships, institutional cultural facilities and higher education facilities, and some of the energy conservation projects as well. So I would like to welcome Mr. Uchil. So you can start your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, Parikshit. I'll just give you a small brief, about how I got into MEP, and then I will jump straight into the presentation. Uh, MEP, as you know, in the engineering stream, is not it's not a taught subject. You can learn as an engineer. You can learn mechanical engineering and specialize in HVAC, or you can learn electrical engineering, or you can learn plumbing as a civil engineer. But all of these things put together is a fairly it's a fairly specialized line of work, and not too many people even know about it. I started my career in HVAC, but I was fortunate to be given an opportunity to work for a multidisciplinary MEP consultant, and that's where I learned everything else. Yeah. Um, I'll start the presentation. I'm focusing on tall buildings. Right, here we go. As you all can see, there are the two images in this on the first screen on the start of the presentation are two buildings in Mumbai. We are in a very tropical environment, and my focus today is on building design, on MEP building design, uh, with a bit of emphasis on tropical design, because I'm sure that many of your students will be moving to other places, going overseas to work as architects. But I'm also quite confident a lot of you will stay back and and do some landmark work over here. So I'll just try and focus on these. So if you can see, these two projects they're very close to each other, maybe 2 kilometers away, but the architectural style is very different. And these two different architectural styles call for very different ways of treating or handling MEP. You can see the buildings on the left, they're twin towers, and they're in South Mumbai, and they're more conventional design of structure with windows and balconies, and it's a more more restricted to a tropical environment. And the building on the right is a typical modern Manhattan. While both are residential buildings, this one is completely a glass facade. So the MEP in each case is handled differently, and we'll just go through that, and we'll see how it goes. Parikshit, I can't. I just want to just make sure that I'm audible because
Yeah.
my
You're
video
audible.
has stopped. Yeah.
No, you are audible. Yeah.
All right. Great. Super. So, what is the role of MEP in tall buildings, right? So there's mechanical, which is M. Then there's electrical, plumbing, fire protection, and to add to this, MEPF is something that's becoming very, very important for us, and something that as architects you all will be very interested in, and would definitely like to delve into in great detail. I'll leave enough of time for that last module that we've put together and that we'll discuss today, right? So I'll start. So HVAC mechanical primarily consists of HVAC, and the most important part of any building, no matter how beautifully you design it, it has to be a thermally very comfortable environment. People have to be, comfortable. The temperature has to be in a range where everybody is comfortable to live or to work or just to be. Uh, Without a good, steady, and stable electrical power supply, the building is as good as dead. I mean, you can't occupy the building. And the same goes for the plumbing and fire protection systems. Each one of them have their own. They have their own importance, and I would be hard pressed if somebody had to ask me that, what would be the most important of all these four disciplines. It's like the human body. You can't work without either one of them. If if the plumbing systems are not working, and if it's nice and cool and the electrical systems are all fine, but what do you do if there's no water in the building or the drainage system is not good? And so is the case with the fire protection systems and HVAC systems. Uh, I just want to touch upon HVAC, uh, the, and the kind of systems that are available. Can you all see my cursor? Parikshit, is my cursor visible on the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So there are primarily two types of air conditioning systems. The system that you see on the right, which is the right bottom image, is the simplest system possible, wherein we have an outdoor unit, we have an indoor unit. I'm sure everybody has seen them. Most of them are in most of these systems you will see in your own house. What happens? How the system functions? Basically, the air conditioning system, through electrical and mechanical means, works to remove heat from the indoor and expel it outdoor. So the outdoor unit and works to expel the heat outside. You can see, if you all can see, there are two pipes. One is the pipe which is supplying refrigerant, and one is the pipe which is taking back refrigerant. The heat is carried to the outdoor unit through the refrigerant. It's very simple. The whatever heat is there inside, it is transferred through the refrigerant piping and through the refrigerant fluid and dispelled out to the outside atmosphere. Uh, Moving to a slightly more evolved form of this split air conditioning system is a VRF system. A VRF is variable refrigerant flow. It's very similar to a conventional split system, except that in this case, the piping network is the same. So if you can see, there are two different types of high wall units over here. They are both connected to one set of pipes which go to the outdoor unit. The benefit of this kind of system is that you don't have outdoor units everywhere. If you see a normal building nowadays in a residential building, there are split units everywhere. And on the facade or in the shaft, you will see multiple outdoor units placed. And the reason that they are placed is because the outdoor units, because the indoor units are multiple, and then hence you have multiple outdoor units also. With a variable refrigerant flow system, you have only one outdoor unit for maybe 12, 15, 20 or indoor units. And in the case of apartments, maybe there'll be one outdoor unit for each apartment. So this has made life a little better for architects and designers, because they don't have to hide or camouflage these outdoor units. I personally feel they look very nice, but most people don't agree with me. So the job of the architect becomes a little easier by going in for these VRF systems. There are benefits, there are problems with this kind of system. We can have a discussion about this a little later. On the left is the original system. This is what was designed by Willis Haviland Carrier maybe 100 years ago, and that's how the air conditioning system started. It's called a chilled water system. Uh, Chilled water is produced in a chiller plant room. Maybe it's placed somewhere in the basement, and the heat from the building is actually expelled to the atmosphere through cooling towers. So it's a central system. The chiller produces chilled water. When it is producing chilled water, it has to take away the heat from the building environment, and it does that by way of a cooling tower and a condenser water system. So the heat gets carried to the cooling tower. There are fans on top of the cooling tower. The water falls through baffles in the cooling tower, and as it falls through baffles, the heat is picked up by the atmosphere. There's a bit of drip, some evaporation, and then the uh, cool water comes back to the chiller. Uh, on every floor, as you can see, there will be something called an air handling unit. Now, if you look at an air handling unit, the chilled water passes through this air handling unit, and there is a fan which draws the air through this chilled water coil. And that air is cooled down and is supplied to various parts of the environment which it is seeking to cool. And how does it transmit this? It transmits it to ducts. As you can see, there are ducts. These ducts run in most cases through the false ceiling. And then there are diffusers and branches, and this air is given into the room. And as the air falls into the room, because the air is cool and it is dense, it starts to drop down and it picks up heat, and then it forms a circular motion where the warm air starts to rise and go back to the air handling unit. So this is primarily you can say, two main types of air conditioning systems. There are other systems as well, but for the purpose of from what you all will encounter for 95% or maybe even 98% of the projects that you all will be involved in, these are the systems that you will encounter uh, most often. I'll stop now. Again, air conditioning is a vast subject. Parikshit, I'll open to questions. I'll just stop sharing my screen, and we can take questions from anybody who wants to ask.
On the HVAC?
Yes, on HVAC.
Okay. So anybody has a question, guys, about HVAC system?
You can either raise your hand and speak, or you can type in the chat box. I can see both.
Yeah, anyone?
If you all don't have questions, then I'm going to randomly pick people and ask them questions to just make sure that everyone's paying attention over here.
I think they will have consolidated questions at the
No
end.
problem.
But
So we'll continue.
yeah.
All right. Is the speed that I'm going at is okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. Right. So moving on, this was in a nutshell basically how air conditioning systems function and the types of air conditioning systems that are available. We move on to electrical systems. Now, in every building or every project that we design, we have to get electricity from the supply company. Uh, the chain of supply is as follows. You have the actual electrical power generating plants. They can be thermal, they can be hydroelectric, they can be wind generated, and they can be solar. Now, this power has to be transmitted to the buildings and to cities and to townships and other places. So the electrical supply comes through cables. In most cases, they are transmitted at very high voltages at using these overhead transmission lines. I'm sure people would have seen these transmission lines, especially if you're on a highway, on the Eastern Express Highway or the Western Express Highway in Bombay, or while you're passing the Vashi Bridge, you can see a lot of these transmission lines. Now, through these transmission lines, they come to areas receiving stations, and from the receiving stations, it comes to something called a building substation. Now, at the building substation, the voltage, which is the transmission voltage, is usually in kilovolts, like 132 or 66 or 11,000 kilovolts. And what we actually use in our built environment is 440 volts. So to step it down from say 11,000 volts to 440 volts, we require something called a substation. Once you step it down in the substation, the power is passed on to these panels. These panels are most often in the basement of a building, and from there, then it goes. You can see these are the rising the ducts through which the cables are taken to something called an electrical riser. In this case, I've just put in a small image of a drawing of a typical core, a building core, which has a couple of elevators, it has a staircase, it has a lobby, and it has these shafts. So the electrical riser comes up through these electrical shafts. There is a separate shaft for electrical systems. There is a separate shaft for telephone and for other low voltage systems. Today there's cable TV, there's internet, there's so many other things. So we keep them separate, because the electrical systems, the voltage is transmitted at 420, 440 volts, whereas in the case of low voltage systems like telephone, distribution, and internet, it's 12 volts. So it is advisable to separate these two shafts so that there is no electrical interference on the low voltage systems like telephone and data. So once it comes up through the risers, it then goes to, so as you can see, there's these. This is an image of the actual riser where you can see the cables. These cables are neatly fixed onto cable trays, and then they are taken up. From this cable riser, the individual cable comes to something called a distribution board, which consists of circuit breakers. These are all safety devices to prevent any kind of mishap or due to short circuit and other issues that come up with electrical systems. And from the distribution board, there is further circuiting to lights, to power points, to appliances, various things that we use either in a residential environment or in a commercial environment, where we have, in an office, you have computers and lighting, and also to the air conditioning system. So now I'm just going to move on through plumbing as well as firefighting and the other modules. And Parikshit, if anybody wants to ask a question, they can type in the chat box and you can read it out, because I can't see the chat box right.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Plumbing is probably one of the most underrated and of least interest to most engineers who come out of colleges today. The first option is, of course, always computer science and electronics and the new age technologies. Then it comes to electrical and mechanical. But plumbing systems are literally the veins of any built environment. And if you don't have an efficient and technically correct plumbing system, the space becomes almost impossible to occupy. Uh, here's a 3D of one of our projects in Mumbai. You can see in the background are the tanks, are the water tanks. There are fire tanks, which are used to fight fire in case, God forbid, there's a fire in the building. The fire tanks then overflow into the domestic and flushing tanks. That's what is used for the water supply system. Now, if you can see on the left-hand side, you will see the firefighting pumps, which are in red. Now, these firefighting pumps, they supply water right from the bottom, which is usually in a basement, to the top terrace level of the building, and the water is available to fight fire uh, all the time. These firefighting systems, as per law, are always under pressure. They're always pressurized. So at any given point of time, if you go and open a valve in a firefighting system, the water will start to flow at a very high pressure, and the pumps will start automatically once it senses that a valve has been opened. In a building, I'll come further, I'll delve further detail into firefighting in the next module. On the right-hand side, you can see the pumping systems. These are the pumps which transfer the water to the overhead tanks. And from the overhead tanks, there is a ring on the terrace. Usually it's on the terrace. And from this ring, there are tappings into every shaft, so that water is supplied at a constant and steady pressure in all the bathrooms. On the right hand side, you can see an image of the pumping systems. Now, these pumps and this brown color device over here, this is called an air vessel. These pumps are part of a system called a hydro-pneumatic system. Hydro is water, pneumatic is air. A hydro-pneumatic system supplies water directly from the underground tank directly into each of the bathrooms and to the terminal devices like taps or sinks or showers or whatever the water is being used for. It doesn't get pumped into an overhead tank and come by gravity. As the pipes go up, they keep tapping into all the flows. Now, a hydropneumatic system again works automatically. If there are 100 taps that the system is supplying to, once 3 taps or 4 taps or 10 taps are opened, the pressure in the system allows the water to flow out, and the moment the pump senses that the pressure in the line is going down, it starts automatically, and once the pressure is achieved again, it stops. Hydropneumatic systems are used quite extensively, especially in hotel projects and in commercial projects or in buildings where, because of height restrictions, we are not able to provide overhead tanks. And so the lines run at the ceiling of the basement and directly enter into the shaft and supply to the various outlet points. This is the basic firefighting system. If you see on the left is an image of a firefighting pump room. It's a life safety system, one of the most critical systems that should always be available to work and should always be online. Firefighting systems, I cannot emphasize strongly enough. We've had many fires in which the firefighting systems have not come on, and that's primarily due to either ignorance of the people who are maintaining the firefighting systems or because of poor maintenance. So it's a simple system. It consists of water tanks in the basement. The capacity of these water tanks is determined by laws. National Building Code defines the water tank capacity depending upon the type of building, the floor plate of the building, the population, and the height of the building. So based on all these factors in National Building Code, there is a table. You can go and see and actually size the water tanks in the basement for firefighting. This is very important for students who are designing a building in which they have to also design the storage utilities for water, for fire, and other services. The water is drawn through pumps, and the pumps then supply the water through something called a wet riser. It's called a wet riser because there's always water under pressure in these risers. If you can see, on every floor there is a something called a landing valve. Now there are two tap-offs on every floor. One is a landing valve to which the access is actually for only firefighting personnel and not for the residents or occupiers of the building, because you need to be trained to use the water which is coming out of these landing valves. They are at a very high pressure and at a very high discharge. So if a untrained person tries to connect a hose and open the valve and fight a fire, he might most likely get injured because he might not be able to handle the pressure. In addition to a landing valve, there is something called a first aid hose reel. That's a rubber hose reel which supplies a limited amount of water at a far lower pressure, and this is to be used by residents or occupiers of the building in case of first aid, to put out a small fire, or if somebody's clothes are on fire, you draw the you draw the hose out and you use that. I'm sure that all of you have seen both these things, and all of you must have wondered why there are two separate type of fire fighting systems on every floor. So this is the primary reason. The one is for the use of trained fire personnel, and the other one is for the use of the general public who are occupying that space. The water supply line goes directly up to the terrace and can be connected to an overhead firefighting tank if that is demanded by codes, or it terminates at an air vent at the roof level. Now, this is the fire cabinet that I was talking about on every floor. If you see, this is the landing valve on the right, where you can connect this hose over here. You can connect it to this landing valve, but this is to be operated only by firefighting personnel who are trained to handle this pressure and discharge. Then you can see the first aid hose reel and the tapping for the first aid hose reel through a small pressure reducing device, so that a much lower flow is available and at a much more manageable pressure. Apart from this active fire protection system, there are also passive fire protection systems like fire extinguishers. These are handheld devices, and they actually have to be taken out of the cabinet and used to extinguish any of the fires of the smaller nature, which can be extinguished with these devices. Another very important component of the fire protection system is the fire alarm system. Again, it's a fairly simple system. There's a fire alarm panel, and that's usually at a place at ground level, which is manned on a 24-hour basis, maybe security cabin, maybe a building manager. And this panel should be visible. You should be able to see the display and the alarms that are coming. Many times, the panel is placed in a closet or in a room which is not occupied, and even though the system works, we don't realize that there is a fire. So there is a fire alarm panel, and this fire alarm panel uh, talks to or receives information from these terminal devices. There are smoke detectors, there are strobes, there are sounders. Like a strobe is for handicapped people who cannot hear. So they get alerted by the flashing strobe on the floors that they are on, and then they evacuate. Then there's also sounders as well as horns, which also give out the same give out of sound, so if people can't see, then they are again alerted to the fact that there's a fire and you have to evacuate. The fire alarm systems, especially at least in my opinion, are very good because it gives you a very early warning in the event of a fire, because the smoke detectors, before the fire even catches and takes place, the smoke detectors are able to detect the fires and sound the alarm. And if addressed in time, if there's a person who can see the alarm without too much of problem, the fire can be extinguished. But most important system is the firefighting system. In addition to this, the landing valves in this cabinet, another important part of the firefighting system is the sprinkler system, which is nothing but a network of pipes which have sprinkler bulbs. They're called sprinkler bulbs, and they are there uh, to extinguish, and these bulbs burst at certain set temperatures, maybe 58 degrees or 64 degrees or 120 degrees, depending upon the environment. And as they burst, the water comes out and extinguishes the fire. It's automatic. It doesn't require any kind of manual intervention. If there is a fire and you have a sprinkler system, it will safely extinguish the fire. The pumps will come on and water will come out and extinguish the fire. This is some idea. I mean, this is for students who are planning a building, just to understand the kind of spaces that we have to provide for in the basement for these various utilities, like an electrical substation for a building, maybe about 300 to 400,000 square feet. And that's what most of the size of the built spaces are in a tall building, is approximately 18 meters by 8 meters. It varies depending upon the capacity. Then you need to provide about 12 meters by 8 meters for the main panel room. If you require to provide DG backup, then you need an outdoor space, because DGs are preferably placed outside. They become hot and they require a lot of ventilation if they are placed in basements. Then you require the space or the footprint for the water tanks, and then also for your AC plant room and STP plant room, that's about 20 meters by 10 meters and 30 meters by 15 meters. These are approximate sizes for a building of maybe 300 to 400,000 square feet of built-up area. This is very important because it will be very critical to all of you who are designing a typical floor, and you need to provide space for these MEP utilities, these shafts, without which it is not possible to transmit, convey power the flows that you're designing. So typically a fire shaft requires a space of 1.5 meters by 1 meter. An electrical riser shaft requires a space. See, as you can see, the depth is much less because electrical cables are not very thick in diameter. So for the electrical riser shaft, you require about 2.4 meters by 0.6 meters. For chilled water, this is for if you have a central air conditioning system and not a VRF system. For chilled water, the riser shaft is about 1.5 meters by 0.9 meters. That's 3 feet. Every plumbing, every toilet usually requires a shaft. In India, the practice is to provide a shaft outside the toilet. In many other countries in the world, I have seen the shafts run within the toilet itself, or rather the utilities, the pipes run within the toilet itself. So a reasonable way to define the size of a shaft is the width of the toilet, the shorter side. If you have a typical toilet of say 2.4 meters by 1.2 meters, the width is the 1.2 meter side, about 1.2 meter depth. And in case you have a fire staircase which is within the building and is not ventilated to the atmosphere, then you need a size of approximately 1.2 meters by 0.9 meters. I'll just delve a little more into this fire staircase and pressurization once as we move on. Now, this is the last module of my presentation, and something that you all will be very interested in. It's environment and sustainable measures. Today, buildings are being designed on the basis of making them green, carbon neutral, uh, very environmentally friendly structure. There are two strategies for environment and sustainability. There are passive strategies and there are active strategies, and I'll delve into both of them. If you look at the passive strategies, the solar orientation of a building has a great emphasis on the energy consumption needs of the building. In the northern hemisphere, more openness on the north side, more windows on the north side will allow more light and yet keep the heat out of the building. So I'm sure that you all would have learned to put a building plan on a solar table. Parikshit, is it something that students have?
Yeah, they are doing it in
Learned?
fourth year, and yeah, they are doing
Super.
it in fourth year.
So you can actually orient the building to get mm, maximum energy efficiency. And the second way of doing it is by using high performance facades. If there's glass, then you go for a glass which is maybe double glazed or triple glazed, or with certain gases. I'm sure that our facade presentation has taken these things into consideration. So these are most of the passive strategies. We also have active strategies, and this is where it gets really interesting, because in active strategies you can really do some great things. So we have radiant cooling, we have solar responsive facades, we have building integrated PV. PV stands for photovoltaics, which is the generation of electricity from photovoltaic panels. So it's solar electric. Then you have rooftop PVs and you have wind turbines. Wind turbines are, uh, they're not, they make a wonderful statement. I have some pictures after this where you can see how small wind turbines have been incorporated into a building. So let's go through all of these one by one. Uh, if you look at the passive green building strategies, as I said, you can actually orient the building in a manner where the glass and the openings are more towards the north side, so more light is let in, yet the heat is kept out. As you can see, the winter sun moves in a different trajectory, and the summer sun also moves in a different trajectory. And on the right hand side, you can see the various types of this is a high performance glass where there's laminated glass, and then there's a air gap or something with a filled with some kind of neutral like gas like argon, and then you have the third glass, which is the external side of the glass. So all these things contribute to reducing the ingress of heat, and because the heat ingress reduces, your air conditioning needs are much lower, and the energy which is used up in the air conditioning system starts to go down. Uh, I don't know if anybody has heard about radiant cooling. I'm sure you all would have studied it at some point of time, but I'll just give you an idea. It's the 20th century application of technology in buildings which was there many centuries ago. If you see old buildings and monuments, you will all notice that the thickness of these monuments, the wall thicknesses are huge. I mean, they are in some cases the walls are even 3 feet, 900 thick, or a meter thick, and this was to facilitate the storage of heat. So the either in winter, it would ensure that that space was warm, and in summer, it would ensure that the space was cool. So the radiant cooling system does the same thing using technology in a slab that or a wall that might be 150 mm or 200 mm thick. What you do is, you can see these are the red pipes which are laid in a network in the RCC structure, and then concrete is poured onto it, so it gets integrated into the structure. If you can see in the visual image over here, this section, the little blue dots are the pipes which are embedded in the slab. And what we do is simply we pass not chilled water, we pass cool water, which is at about 15 to 17 degrees Celsius, and it slowly cools the whole building envelope down without having to actually provide the air handling units and all these things. Radiant cooling is a very effective method of energy saving in air conditioned buildings. It makes a there's close to 30-35% saving over any conventional kind of air conditioning system. Now, if this was such a wonderful thing, why is it not used so often, and why don't we hear about it? Because there are some restrictions to the system. As you all can see over here, there are no fall ceilings. So all your ceiling elements, sprinkler pipes, lights, they will all get. Many people don't prefer that kind of a look, and they would prefer to have fall ceilings and neat and all the lights and all the services hidden behind that. So that's one of the limitation factors of the radiant cooling. These are solar responsive facade systems, especially in cities like Bombay, where we are on the sea face and everybody would like to have a sea view. And in most cases in Bombay, the sea view is on the west facade or the south facade. There is that challenge where you want to have the views, but the solar impact is the most severe on these two faces, on the south face and the west face. So when the sun moves from the east to the west, we have these solar responsive facades which can open and shut and automatically control their movement to cut out the heat, especially when the sun is on the south and west side. In many cases, they can be manually operated, and in many cases, there are photo sensors which sense the amount of solar light which is transmitting, and automatically the louvers, the facades respond to that and open or shut. Again, something that you budding architects would like to look into, because you can make your building have a very unique character using these kind of facade elements. Then we have building integrated photovoltaics. If you can see on the left, there's a shadow which is cast by these transparent photovoltaic panels which are fixed onto the glass facade. And you can see that the panels are actually, the shadows are casting a pattern on the floor. It's not the most efficient of the photovoltaics, because photovoltaics work very well when they face south and at an angle of between 30 and 45 degrees, like what you see on the right hand side, which is the more conventional form of solar PV, which is on the roof. In many states in India, today you don't even need batteries. You can put these photovoltaic panels either on the roof or in very few cases on the facade. And during the day, when the photovoltaic panels are generating electricity, the building can use this electricity. And if the demand of electricity goes below the electricity which is being generated by these photovoltaics, the energy is actually fed back into the city grid. It's fed back into the grid system, and whatever units of energy you are consuming from the city, say from, in our case, it is from Adani Electricity or BEST. So from these utilities, the number of units that you consume, when you give it back, it gets deducted your net. So it's called a net metering system, and these are also called grid connected, GCPV systems, grid connected photovoltaic systems. very exciting. 10 years ago, I would probably have not even put it in this presentation because it was so expensive and there was no payback period. What do I mean by payback period? When I install something to save energy, the cost of that system should be paid back to me within a certain period of time so that I can get the benefit of that capital investment. From 10 years to today, the cost of photovoltaics has gone from roughly 350 to 400,000 rupees per kilowatt hour. So now you can get them as cheap as 35,000 to 50,000 rupees per kilowatt hour. Now this is the statement kind of system. This is a wind turbines. There's a voltage center at Bahrain and the Pearl River Tower. I'm sure that you all have seen this in your architecture books. They make quite a statement. As long as there's a good wind force in the area where you make this building, it's something that you can consider. Something very important that has revolutionized the energy efficiency of buildings in the last 5 years is LED lighting. So you can see there are various types of LED lighting. There's these LED profile lights. These lights have been able to reduce the lighting consumption part by close to maybe even 50% or 70% of what it used to be when we were using incandescent bulbs or fluorescent tube lights. Today, typically an LED bulb like this, the first one on the left hand side, is approximately 3 watts or 5 watts or 7 watts, and it gives you the lumen output which is equivalent to a 40-watt bulb. So this one single innovative technology like LED lighting has led to a huge drop in the energy consumption of on the electrical, on the lighting side of the of all our built environments. These are just a couple of images of how you can use the built facade to add gardens and to also reduce the energy load in the building, because all these things shield the occupants from absolute direct radiant sunlight. These are one project in Rotterdam and the other one is in this fusion of policies in Singapore. Another very interesting method of energy conservation, especially in our tropical environments. If you all see, I guess most of you are living in Bombay. During the monsoons, the temperatures outside are very, very reasonable. But because of the intensity of the monsoon, we are forced to close the windows. Now, when you close the windows in an apartment, especially in a high-rise building, because the wind pressure is so high that if you keep the windows open, the rain will enter into the office or into the apartment. We keep the windows shut and we start the air conditioning system. So Voha Architects, you can go read about it. It's a very interesting concept that they developed for a building in Singapore. They put monsoon windows, and these monsoon windows, instead of being vertical, they are horizontal. So you can actually open these windows when there's good breeze or in the monsoon climate. So there's wind, you can ventilate the apartment with breeze through this window. Yet at the same time, you can keep the vertical windows closed and prevent water from entering into the built space. These are the kind of things as architects you should strive to develop as an architectural design, which will really add amazing value to a environmentally sustainable and a neutral and a green building. That's it. I'll stop my sharing.
Any questions, guys?
Is everyone awake? Is rainwater harvesting possible? Okay. Pratik, yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I seem to have missed that out in my presentation. In every building in where we are in Bombay, in our city and also in other suburban or rural environments, rainwater harvesting is definitely possible. There are two types of rainwater harvesting systems that we usually have. The first type is a storage system. So water is collected, the rainwater, which is taken down from the roof of the building. It is taken down through piping, and there's a bypass line where the water can go and get stored in a tank. This is called a cistern kind of rainwater harvesting, where actually the water is stored in a tank and it is filtered and used for flushing, gardening. For you can use it for many things because rainwater is among the purest forms of water that we can get hold of. The second type of system is called a recharge system, where the rainwater from the terraces and the hard surfaces, they get run off, they pass through a small filtration chamber, and then they recharge back into the earth. In this, what happens is that over a period of time, through every monsoon, where we are actually recharging the water into the earth rather than running it off onto the road and out into the sea in our case, the water gets recharged into the ground and it slowly raises the groundwater table in your area. So the quality of your borewell water improves over a period of time. In Bombay city, because our water table during the monsoons is so high, we prefer to put a cistern kind of system where for nearly 4 to 5 months of the year we can collect the water, we can store it, we can filter it and reuse it. That's it. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have one more doubt.
Yeah.
So like in a sustainable kind of building,
Right.
since water is a major, like if we try to save more water,
Yes.
so like in a tall building, so the aspect ratio is supposed to be 4, and the area of the collection, since it's a terrace which is the hard flooring, so what can be done to collect more rainwater, like if we have a vertical surface, so is
Yeah.
there any kind of system where we can
So
use that vertical system?
any surface that any surface on the plot that is not trafficked. Whereas, if there is a podium where it's just a landscape podium, that also can be used. In most cases, Pratik, the terraces itself are of a sufficient size because see, there's a limitation to the amount of water that you can store in a cistern. You can put a tank of maybe 100,000 liters or 100 cubic meters, but space constraints don't allow you to put more than that. So in most cases, the water which comes from is collected from the terrace itself is sufficient, and with the kind of rainfall that we receive in Bombay, it takes care. See, to answer your question specifically about collecting water from the vertical facades, yes, of course, you can do some kind of collection points or little troughs that where you can collect the water, but ultimately the water from these vertical facades are also going to go down and get collected on your plot. So as long as you deduct the motorable surfaces where there's oil or petrol or diesel that's likely to contaminate the water that you're trying to harvest, you have more than enough of space which is available to you for your plot and for your water.
Okay, sir.
All right, thank you. Salik, you wanted to ask a question? You can
Yes,
go ahead.
sir.
You had raised your hand.
Yes, sir. So my question is that in case where we have renewable energy sources designed in a tall building, there are some buildings which are net zero buildings, and there are even some buildings which sell the energy back to the grid. So how exactly is the server system designed for that? For example, do they at all depend on the grid and then the energy they produce is completely sold back, or they use the same energy that they produce? So they will have to store that energy somewhere. They'll have to provide more ducts to separate the two system, the grid system and the energy they're producing.
Right. So how does this happen? If we're talking about selling energy back, we're talking about grid connected solar power. There are places in the world where companies like Tesla have started providing battery packs to actually store and reuse the energy that the building generates. But in
Yes, sir.
most cases, even in India, where and in our side of the world, in Bombay and Maharashtra, where there's so much of solar energy available through the year, we don't produce enough to meet all our needs. And the
Okay.
government also, they put a restriction on the amount you can sell back to them. Because if you allowed
Okay.
everybody to sell to the government, then the government would go, that energy utility would kind of go bankrupt because they won't be selling to anybody. Everybody would be selling to them. And who would they sell to? So there is a restriction and there is a balance. Answer the first part of your question. Yes, you can have storage. Yes, you can have batteries. But the moment you add batteries, it increases the cost of the system, and then the payback period starts to
Mm-hmm.
go a little haywire. So you have to balance both these things: the cost of putting a, a carbon neutral system as against the payback for the system over a period of time.
Understood, sir.
I think this system
Thank
is
you.
good for, I mean, storage system will be good for institutional projects or maybe hospitality
Yes,
projects. Yeah, yeah.
yes. Also, it will be very useful for places which are not on the grid. I mean, like a farmhouse in maybe in Karjat, or where there's no, or there's very erratic supply of energy. In these places, you could have a complete storage system and reuse. Because then, in that case, you're not considering any kind of payback or some return on investment. You require it to run the systems that you have.
Sir, I just have one point. Can you
Go
please
ahead.
highlight something regarding lightning arrestor, location-wise,
Sure, sure,
aesthetic-wise, and
sure.
planning-wise? Yeah.
Uh, Most lightning arrestor systems, I will mail all of you a small note on lightning arresters. Again, it is something that it delves a little deeper into electrical systems, so I have not included it in the presentation, but I will send you all a small note on this, right? So a lightning arrestor system, as per current electricity rules, requires a lightning arrestor points on the terrace, which forms a network, and that network then comes down by use of either any conductive material like copper or galvanized iron strips, and that goes to an earthing pit. Now, if there is a lightning strike, the lightning arrestor system actually picks up the energy of the lightning strike and conveys it into the ground, while at the same time protecting the building. That's the in the simplest terms how a lightning protection system works. Taking your architectural aspects into consideration, you have to figure out how you can avoid showing these strips, because the strips are uniformly distributed around the building to ensure that lightning doesn't strike a part of the building which is not protected. So it becomes like a grid around the 4, 5, 6, how many number of facades you have. It becomes a grid, and that grid then goes to a dedicated earth where the energy is conveyed and taken and drawn back into the earth. There is a way of hiding these, that when you're doing the construction, at the time of construction, you connect these lightning down conductors to the structure of the building itself. It's called whole building earthing system. Again, it's a subject of maybe 15-20 minutes of discussion. I will put it on a small presentation and send it to Parikshit sir, then he can circulate it to all of you. Does it answer your question? You have anything specific to ask me?
No, 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 that's it. Sure.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Any
With
more
the tall
questions?
buildings, the basics of. Hello.
Sorry. No.
Go ahead,
How
Pratik.
is earthing done? How is the earthing done?
In what way? I just explained it. What part of that did you not understand?
Like how does it reflect in the ground floor plan? Like, kiti's
Oh,
pit
it's below the
size?
there's a pit. There's a pit. That pit size is a foot by a foot, 300 mm by 300 mm, and that also can be covered with a chamber. You need access to that pit, but it doesn't need to be visible. But one thing since we are discussing earthing, one thing you have to remember is that today's buildings with all the heavy electrical systems and data systems require a lot of earth pits. And these earth pits are usually put in virgin ground, in earth. Now, if you look at a typical high-rise buildings, you will have probably 30 to 40 earth pits. And these earth pits have to be placed at a center to center of approximately 2 meters. So when you're designing the building, you have to make sure that between the plot boundary and the basement, if you have a basement, the space between that is sufficient to allow you to put these earth pits. So it's something that everybody should note, that some space has to be given. Otherwise, if you have a basement, you can actually put your earth pits in the basement itself. But it is a very specialized system, and the waterproofing, because it punctures through the raft, it has to be very, very properly done and efficient. But yes, that is also another way of doing earthing.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, any more question?
I think I have to send a lot of chocolates to Pratik and Salik, because they are the only two guys who have asked me questions.
Okay.
My question is, can I get?
Yes.
I asked you a
Anuja,
question.
please ask.
No,
You will
that
get
was a
it directly on your terrace from my office.
So that is a question. You wanted a question, so I asked, can I get it?
Sure.
So answer is yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anuja.
So can you highlight a little bit about building illumination and the maintenance of it? Because you know they are designing some tall buildings, and
Okay.
they need to provide this kind of.
So building illumination is again a different subject altogether. The
Right.
specialists in that are architects who have done lighting design. Uh, Again, it's not really my field of purview or forte, but I'll just highlight a few points that if when you're designing lighting on facades, uh, always highlight the hard surfaces of your facade and not the glass, because glass will not give you that kind of impact of lighting. Most of it is just going to either get absorbed or reflected out. So highlight the hard facades and try and keep it subtle. The most subtle these highlights are when you're doing lighting design for a facade as architects. I mean, when you do a very specialized building, you will definitely hire the services of a lighting consultant who's done his or her architecture and then has learned lighting design. But in this case, the more subtle you are, otherwise the buildings tend to start looking like they have been lit up for a festival, which is not really what you want. And since facade lighting is primarily for aesthetic purposes, you also have to ensure that the lights that you use are very energy efficient. In all cases, they are on timers or they are on sensors. So after a certain period of time, say by 9:30 or 10 p.m., when the space outside is less trafficked and there are less people on the road, and you don't want there's nobody to see your beautiful structure, these lights will go off.
Okay, I have one or two points to add over here.
Yes, ma'am.
Very, very rightly said by Rohit. There are 2 to 3 kinds of lights, and in that there are aviation lights too. So for the high rises, there's an integration of the aviation lights, which is for the flights to see them. So you will always see high rises with the blinking lights at the intermediate levels and even at the top terrace. That is for the flights to see those lights. And as he said that these all facade light needs to be integrated even with your facade design. So there are 3 to 4 people who cohesively work. So it's a coordination with MEP consultant. It's a coordination between facade consultant and the lighting designer and the architect, who all come together, they sit together and define that how you want to work on the lighting strategy. So basically, yes, the concept is given by the architect and the lighting designer, but there is a whole sort of an integration which happens into the entire high rise. And there are some which are these aviation lights are the statutory requirement, and those are been certified by the GVK, who is like an airport authority, and they come and they do their survey and then they give you the certification. So that's how the lighting design is done. And the fifth aspect of it is that uplighting is always avoided from the green perspective, because you don't want to disturb the nocturnal life. So there is always a downlighting which is recommended. And it has to have a lighting power density as per the LEED certification what you're going for. So as per that, the lighting design has been done. And then there are various ways. Even nowadays, there are facades which are like facades of malls where you integrate the entire LED facades, or you have a big screen. So these are called as a digital facade. So that's the another way of looking at the facade, where facade itself with the integrated solar panels turning into a very active media walls at the night. So there are so many things which can be integrated with facade. That's it.
Super. Thanks, Anuja.
Right. Thanks. Anybody else? Okay. So I think
If anybody wants to ask any questions later, also please reach out to me by email. Parikshit sir has my contact details. Anything you want to know about? There are so many subjects which I have not really touched upon, like LEED and other green building codes, although these form such an important part of architecture today because of the environment and sustainability required. But we could actually have 1 hour discussion only on each one of these topics. So if anybody needs to ask something, please do. Please, I'll be happy to respond.
Sure, sir. Okay, then thanks. Vinit sir, are you there? Okay, I think Vinit sir and Gauri sir is not here, but
I'm just driving back.
Acha, okay. No issues.
Had that kind of nice. All the aspects you have covered under the MEP very well. It was great. I guess this might have questions which to you on. I guess that's how they will start getting answers. And I guess their work kind of projects like Atir is working on I guess that having lots of questions will come back to you with this kind of questions.
Sure.
And so I guess the people, as in when they require it, 50-yearites working on their projects, once they start getting kind of queries on for their own design, they will start posting it to you. They will start, I guess, more and more according to their requirement as.
No problem. Happy to help. Anytime.
And thank you very much for sharing this and that time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, Ananda.
Yeah.
Bye. It was great, Rohit.
Thank
as
you.
always.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
And encourages these discussions, participating in discussions also is important. So thank you very much for that encouragement, students as well as for the faculty. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you.